From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz will talk about one aspect of crop nutrient management that you producers should account for, even though it sometimes goes overlooked, he says, the nutrient uptake of the preceding crop. He says this is especially important when considering phosphorus and potassium applications to those summer crops. Then K-State's Brad White and Bob Larson will discuss the impacts that BVD can have on the cow-calf herd, why they recommend checking the herd for BVD prior to spring breeding. And on this week's Wildlife Management segment, K-State's Charlie Lee talks about the difference between bluegill and hybrid bluegill and why that's important in farm pond fish management. All that here on Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local Extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. Well, some principles of importance to you producers as you go about your crop nutrient management and understanding nutrient uptake from the field as that fits into your fertility management for that crop. Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz is going to present some thoughts. He's a crop nutrient specialist with K-State Research and Extension. A different way of thinking about nutrient management here in a sense, Dorivar, the uptake function.
Yes, Eric, I think this is a key point we need to consider for nutrient management. We do have some crops, for example, that take up significantly higher amounts of nutrients compared to others. And as we are pushing yields, of course, these become pretty important as we are managing nutrients in the long term in the soil and making sure we're keeping those nutrient levels. Just to give an example, in the case of soybean, for example, is a big user of potassium. And so over the years, we are seeing more acres of soybean, especially moving central part of the state. And so we do see, of course, more removal of potassium happening with a crop like soybean, which, again, compared to corn, for example, we do have less removal. And so this is one key example where, again, just understanding how much of the nutrients we are removing can impact long-term fertility. One thing that we need to keep in mind, though, is that a couple nutrients that typically will tend to be more impacted by this is phosphorus and potassium. These are immobile nutrients. And so we tend to see this very clearly because, again, we are removing with the harvest grain so many pounds of phosphorus or potassium, and obviously that's going to translate into a decrease in soil levels in the soil. So we're basically talking about how we can replenish these nutrients with fertilizer application. And so it is one of the key components. In fact, in our recommendation system, we do include yield average or yield potential, basically to provide recommendations for both phosphorus and potassium. And in many cases, many producers may actually use exclusively these numbers to basically make sure and provide and replenish the amount of nutrients that they are removing. In other words, based on the yield potential, the yields that they are getting in recent years, basically put back that same amount of nutrients. Just to give an example, in the case of soybean, if we are harvesting, say, a 40 bushel soybean, we are removing easily about 30 pounds of B2O5 and up to about 50 pounds of K2O. So taking this approach, we can essentially apply these amounts to kind of keep that soil test level from dropping over time. So that's one approach and one use that is a key management in terms of nutrient management, in terms of removal and keeping track of what we're harvesting, how much we are removing in terms of nutrients.
But when we're looking at this from this angle, potassium and potash do function generally differently in as far as their uptake tendencies?
Yes, Eric, and this is a very good point. I mentioned corn and soybeans, but one of the key factors is usually that, especially for potassium, the part of the crop that is taking up most of that potassium is different. In other words, for example, if we're harvesting grain versus biomass, if you're thinking about those two main components, in the case of potassium, usually most of the potassium tends to stay in the biomass. So again, even though we are removing significant amounts with soybeans, we have a huge amount of potassium also that stays in the biomass, and that basically cycles back there. As long as we are not removing that biomass from the field, a lot of that potassium goes back to the soil, whatever is not going in the grain. In the case of phosphorus, it's the opposite. In the case of phosphorus, most of the phosphorus usually end up in the grain, in the seeds, and very little stays in the stover, in the biomass. And so this is one case where, if we are, for example, harvesting hay, phosphorus removal with hay is usually not as much. However, for potassium, it's very high. And so again, thinking about what part of the plant we're basically harvesting. Are we harvesting primarily grain, or are we harvesting primarily the biomass? One clear example of this is in the case of alfalfa, for example, or any hay for that matter. In the case of alfalfa, for every ton of hay that we're harvesting, we are removing about 60 pounds of K2O. So that's quite significant. And if you're thinking about a few years of alfalfa, that's going to have a significant impact on potassium. And so again, keeping that in mind, what is the plant part that we're harvesting? Is it primarily biomass or is it primarily grain? That's going to have a different effect on both P and K.
For grain crops, though, once more, on the side of phosphorus, yield will be the indicator. How precise should one be with that, though? Because they have general ideas, do producers, of what a given field yielded. Will that suffice in as far as being relatively close with one's management here?
Yes, that's open many opportunities, actually. If we are thinking about, for example, in the case of yield monitor information, we do have, obviously, areas of the field that yield higher, and those are usually tend to match very well in terms of soil test levels for phosphorus in those areas. In other words, if we have a high-yielding area, obviously we're taking up a lot more phosphorus, and soil test P will tend to be generally lower in that area. So this is one case where using yield monitored information can be very useful to also provide and making sure replenishing the nutrients in those high-yield environments. Now, if we are using average yields from one field, of course, we are not capturing some of this variability. We are looking at really more of an average removal of yield and basically trying to replenish that way. So that's the disadvantage of an average, of course, compared to yield monitor data. But in terms of the concentration of nutrients in the grain for phosphorus and potassium, those are pretty consistent. It doesn't change a lot. In the case of phosphorus for corn, for example, we usually use about 0.3 pounds of P2O5 per bushel and about 0.26 pounds of K2O per bushel of corn. And so these numbers vary very little. And so in other words, if you know how many bushels you are removing, you basically have a good estimate of how many pounds of both P and K basically removing from that field.
Would there be value in this approach when one thinks about other secondary nutrients?
That's a good question, Eric, and that's a little bit less clear because we do have more variability in terms of uptake for other nutrients, and that's where it's a little more difficult to predict how many pounds of other nutrients we are removing with the grain, especially talking about micronutrients. The exception to this may be zinc. In the case of zinc, we do have basically behave quite similarly to phosphorus in many cases. Soil test works pretty well, and so we can see that drop in zinc levels also over time as we are increasing yields and removing more. And so this is one situation where we can see that. But again, one of the things with micronutrients, of course, is that we need very little. So even though we can measure some of these uptake and removals, those values are low. And so we don't usually see it until multiple years of harvesting.
Something that you brought up prior to us getting together and visiting about this, Dorivar, was if one uses those crop nutrient removal levels constantly over several growing seasons, they might want to be careful about what they're reading into that.
Yes, this is information that, to me, I really value this for nutrient management in the short term. I think it has a huge value. If we don't have, for example, soil test data, recent soil test information, we can use this type of value to basically provide nutrients and replenish what we are removing this year or maybe the previous year. So for a short-term nutrient management, I think is an excellent approach. However, one of the key factors with this approach is that there's other things happening in the soil, and we cannot really ignore that. In other words, what else is happening with phosphorus release from organic matter, for example, organic matter decomposition. We talk about the residue that may be cycling back and returning some P and K back to the soil. we're not accounting for those pools of nutrients if we are only counting the grain. And so that's a disadvantage there. And so, in other words, typically we do have more phosphorus coming from mineral soils, from organic fractions of soil, from residue. So those are a significant amount of nutrients that we need to account. And so the only way really to capture that is with soil tests. And so that's still the reason why we rely on soil tests primarily for recommendations of nutrients like P and K. And so, again, we can use removal values for the short term, 1 and 2 years, but then eventually 3 or 4 years, we need to look at what the soil test level is. One of the challenges that I see oftentimes is that some producers that may be going multiple years, and I'm talking 5, 10, 15 years, basically using removal values only, you basically end up building up the nutrients in very high levels. And because, again, we are not accounting for other sources that are coming and providing available nutrients. And so we need to capture that. And so essentially we may be in the long term over-applying fertilizer if we are not checking that soil test value regularly, which I would say every 3 or 4 years would be ideal to look at the balance.
But for the short term, as you say, one might gain some efficiencies here by looking at the uptake factor.
Yes, absolutely. And also just something to keep in mind, historically, of course, we are improving yields. We have better genetics compared to 10, 20 years ago. And so sometimes the default fertility that we are applying maybe is not longer meeting the requirements of higher yielding today. And so that's, I think, one of the key values here. In many cases, we are removing more nutrients. So that basically means we have to apply more. And so we need to keep that in mind. But also, again, don't forget that there's many things happening in the soil in terms of mineralization, mineral release, and we need to account for all of those basically as those become available to crops.
Well, it's an approach that producers might want to put at the forefront of their nutrient management, and that is accounting for that uptake of the nutrients available to the crop or what might be still residing in the residue, whatever the case may be. And Dorivar, appreciate you sharing this with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz is a crop nutrient specialist, K-State Research and Extension. And we'll be back with more for you on Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Well, it's hardly a new health challenge to cattle herds. Most producers will recognize the term bovine viral diarrhea, or BVD. Taking preventative measures against it would be a common part of herd health management. Yet the veterinarians at the K-State Beef Cattle Institute say that BVD is a potentially greater issue than a lot of producers realize, and they talked that up during a recent BCI Cattle Chat podcast. In the conversation, Brad White and Bob Larson, and they were joined by BCI livestock economist Dustin Pendle. Here's Brad to set it up.
Many of our cattle vaccines, whether it's a respiratory vaccine or a reproductive vaccine, include an immunization for a virus called BVD, or bovine viral diarrhea. And Bob, I wanted to talk to you about that a little bit, and I want to address it on the cow-calf side. This might be a good time of year to test if you think you have BVD. And so I may back that up a step and say, what are some of the signs, what are some of the problems I might see in my herd if I had BVD on the cow-calf side?
Yeah. Oh, the BVD virus is interesting in that it does cause a number of different problems. One, it can cause cows to abort their calf. And so we can see some lower pregnancy, lower percentage of the cows that become pregnant or that keep their pregnancy. We can see some calf health issues. So the calf can be born with problems, or he can be exposed after he has been born, and it makes him much more susceptible to some of the scours-causing organisms, much more susceptible to pneumonia come midsummer and those types of things. So BVD virus can affect the respiratory system, the lungs. It can affect the digestive system, through scours and those types of things. It can affect the reproductive system. So it's kind of a unique virus in that it really can impact animals of all ages and lots of different body systems.
So it's not really just diarrhea.
No, and it's
even though
unfortunate.
it's in the name.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that that's in its name because that's only one small piece of it. It's actually some of these other things that are probably more common even. So it's unfortunate that that's in its name, but it can affect a lot of different ages of cattle and a lot of different body systems.
Yeah, nobody wants to have diarrhea in their name.
No.
I see what you're saying.
Bad marketing, yeah.
Yeah, bad marketing on the part of the virus. So as you think about in the herd, so you may have, like you said, more sick calves, repro loss. You could have a variety of symptoms in your herd. And then you kind of touched on, so why would now be, if I think I might have it, why would now be a good time to test?
Well, there are just a couple of really unique things about this virus. It makes it different than basically all the other viruses we work with in livestock production. And one of them is that the biggest source of the virus are these persistently infected calves. And so, persistently, as the name implies, they're always infected. So once infected for life. But the interesting thing, and there's actually several bacteria and viruses and different things that can cause infection for life. But in those situations, you become infected after you're born, which kind of makes sense for if you think about most situations. But this one's different. These calves were actually infected. These persistently infected calves were infected while they were a fetus, while they were still, inside the mother. And that's the only time they can become persistently infected. So if a calf is born and he's not persistently infected, he can never become persistently infected. Even if he's exposed to the virus at a later time, he'll just get the virus for a few weeks or a few days, and then he'll get rid of it. So these persistently infected calves are either born with it or they will never, ever become persistently infected. And so that makes testing really kind of nice because it's a once in a lifetime test. Most other tests, you could be negative today and positive 6 months or a year from now. Not this test. If you're negative today, you will never be positive. So if stop and think about it, that is awesome because we can test these young calves. And because of the effect on fertility and the risk of causing abortion and things like that, if I can find all the persistently infected calves before the start of the breeding season and get them out of the herd, then I pretty much removed all the big source of the virus. And I'm very confident that the test found them all because they can't become persistently infected later. So unique virus, we have accurate tests that work pretty well. And so it really does work really well to remove this virus from the herd. And the timing is to do it before the start of the breeding season.
So this raises a lot of interesting questions for me. You talked about the PI, or the persistently infected calves. What about the cows? Are they?
Yeah. So it is possible for a cow to have been born as a persistently infected calf and to live all the way up to being a 2 or 3 year old cow, but that's very rare because this virus is pretty severe in that particularly if they are persistently infected, they're likely to die long before they ever enter the herd and become pregnant. But cows don't all read the textbook, so a few can do that. So most of the time when I'm talking about this cow, she was exposed. She's not a persistently infected animal herself, but she was just exposed to a persistently infected calf, probably some other calf in the herd or a calf from across the fence or something like that during her pregnancy. And so then she had virus circulating in her body for a couple of weeks during her pregnancy, and that's when her fetus became infected.
It was probably the calf from last year.
Probably last year's PI calf.
Herd, if you didn't remove him until weaning,
right?
He
was
stayed
there
by that cow the first third of gestation.
Yeah, so not only his dam, but all of his dam sisters, he was out there in the vicinity while they were pregnant. And
which is why you're saying now, for a spring calving herd, prior to breeding season, prior to bull introduction, now's the time to test.
That's a good clarification. That's exactly why I don't want him there during the breeding season and early pregnancy.
And so which Do you test all calves then?
Yeah. So now let's get into a little more of the it depends, because you're an ag economist and you love the it depends. So there's two ways to look at it. We've got pretty good numbers on how frequently this virus is infecting herds, and it's probably a little bit less than 10% of herds. So our best estimate is 7% or so of herds, which means that, more than 9 out of 10 herds don't have the virus, wouldn't really benefit from testing. But then you go another way of looking at it is, well, 1 out of 10, and you look around your county and you go, well, that means that there's several herds in this county that have BVD PI calves in them and would benefit from the testing. And so the first question to ask is, am I one of those 9 out of 10 that doesn't have BVD, or am I one of those 1 out of 10 that does? And so usually if you're one of those 1 out of 10, you'll see some signs, the few extra abortions, some calves that seem to have some odd illness, a higher risk of pneumonia in summer calves and scours and those. So when you start having disease problems and kind of this diverse, some affecting the cows, some affecting the calves, that's time to start maybe digging into doing some testing and seeing if there's some BVD in the herd. So, but if I decided to do it, I would test every calf before the start of the breeding season. So every single calf that was born in this calving season, I would test him before the start of the next breeding season if I had suspicion that I might be one of these 1 out of every 10 herds.
One final question. What's the cost to test?
Yeah, good question. And of course, it's going to depend a little bit on the volume and things like that. But put yourself in the test cost category of $3 to $5 per calf. But then you have labor and some other things associated with that. So, yeah, you're getting up there where that's kind of the ballpark to be thinking about to get the testing done.
So the other thing I'd add, and I think great discussion, well, two things I'll add. One, if you're wondering, should I or shouldn't I consider this, great conversation to have with your veterinarian. So have that discussion and say, does this make sense or does this not make sense? Two, be prepared for how you're going to handle the results of the test if they are positive. So one of the recommended disposition techniques for those calves is if they're persistently infected, we will want to remove them from the herd and likely want to euthanize them so that we don't sell them as a calf, because that calf is going to be shedding virus his entire life. So you kind of have to be prepared for that part of it as well, because it doesn't do any good to test and then say, well, I'm just going to leave them in my herd, because then I'm going to have more persistently infected calves next year.
From the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State, Brad White, Bob Larson, and Dustin Pindle. As mentioned, this website devoted expressly to providing answers about BVD and contending with it is a new and a really good resource. It's designed to aid you cattle producers as well as veterinarians in creating BVD control, prevention, and eradication strategies specific to individual herds now. If you go to ksubci.org/BVD, you'll find it, ksubci.org/BVD. You'll also find there the entire Cattle Chat podcast at ksubci.org. We'll step aside for a few moments now. When we return, we'll have today's agricultural news headlines for you, including this week's crop progress update for Kansas from the USDA. And once more, K-State's Charlie Lee awaits with this week's wildlife management segment. Still ahead here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson with you. Next up, today's agricultural news headlines for you, courtesy in part of DTN. beginning with the weekly Kansas Crop Progress and Condition Report from the USDA for the week ending this past Sunday. Topsoil moisture around the state was at 5% surplus and 76% adequate with 19% short to very short. Subsoil moisture, 5% surplus as well, 73% adequate and 22% short to very short. The condition of the winter wheat crop this week, 55% still good to excellent, 28% fair, 17% at poor to very poor. The winter wheat at the jointing stage now in the state, 68%. That's equal to the 5-year average. And winter wheat now headed at 2%. That's behind the 12% average. Corn planting in Kansas is at 20% complete now, behind the average of 27% for the date. And corn emergence is at 6%. That's very near the 7% average. Soybeans planted at 2% in Kansas. That's very near the 1% average for this date. At the national level, as of Sunday, 17% of the intended corn acres had been planted. That's behind the 5-year average of 20%. Texas leading the way with 66% of its corn seeded. Iowa, 20% planted. Illinois at 23%, and Indiana, 14% planted. The corn emergence nationally also slightly behind normal at 3% compared with the 5-year average of 4%. The colder weather appeared to have less of an impact on soybean planting last week. NASS estimates that 8% of the bean crop was planted as of Sunday, ahead of the 5-year average of 5%. Illinois is 18% planted. That's versus a 6% average. Iowa is only 6% planted with its soybeans. Spring wheat planting continues to run ahead of normal at 28%. And winter wheat continues to lag the normal pace. Winter wheat heading at 17% as of Sunday. That's behind the 5-year average of 23%. The condition of the winter wheat crop nationally falling to 49% good to excellent as of Sunday. Again, Kansas rated at 55% good to excellent. Oklahoma at 61%. Texas wheat is only 18% good to excellent, with poor to very poor there at 43%. Sorghum planting nationally 19% complete. And as agricultural interests continue to try to get a read on the new EPA Administrator Michael Regan and the future of the renewable fuel standard, Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack said yesterday that he likes what he sees from the new head of the agency. The EPA is lagging behind on the release of a 2021 renewable volume obligations proposal for the RFS and has several small refinery exemption requests pending for both 2019 and 2020. So far, Regan's EPA has kept its RFS playing cards relatively close to the vest as ethanol and agriculture interests watch. Vilsack said he wants to see USDA and EPA work closely together on the RFS and other issues important to agriculture, and so far he said he believes that will be the case on biofuels. Since 2016, the EPA has granted 88 small refinery exemptions to the RFS. That has led to an estimated loss of demand for ethanol of about 4 billion gallons. The EPA's ability to grant waivers is at issue in that case set for oral arguments now before the Supreme Court. Vilsack said he wants to see the EPA be open and transparent with USDA on any decisions it makes about the renewable fuel standard. Next up, we'll hand it on over to K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook for this week's edition of Milk Lines. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning some insect pests that are showing up on our dairies and creating some issues for us. It's the spring of the year, and it's time for stable flies and their effects on our dairy cattle. And a lot of times I don't think we really quite recognize just how impactful stable flies can be on a dairy operation. You know, there's a lot of good research out there that shows that we can see a decrease in milk production of about 10 to 30% just because of stable flies. And in fact, it only takes about 5 flies per leg to cause a reduction in milk production. Now, what do you see on your dairy farm? You may notice that your animals are starting to bunch in the center of the barn. That's typical what we see, or they will bunch in a certain place on the pasture. Next thing, look to see what they're doing with their legs. If you have a stable fly problem, they'll be stamping their feet. I guarantee it. It's a very common thing that we see, and we can see that from a long ways away. You also see the switching of the tails, but the stamping of the feet, that's a real definite indication that they're getting bit. And that's really the issue as we look at the reduction in production. So what do you need to do about that? It's all about control. Part of that is trying to reduce the areas where those flies are going to be breeding, and that can be basically unused feed or spoiled feed mixed with manure and urine. So if you have hay bale feeders around your farm, that's an excellent place where they breed. However, to really get them under control, you're going to probably have to use some chemical means to actually reduce the levels in your herd. Keep in mind, these insects have a life cycle that's about 3 weeks in duration, and during that time, the females lay a tremendous amount of eggs. So, if you're already seeing issues in your animals because of the adult flies, that means that we probably already have a bunch of eggs spread around. So this isn't just a once-and-done treatment that you're going to have to do. This is a battle you're going to have to fight for the next few weeks. On the crop side of our dairy farms, many of you raise alfalfa, and if you haven't been checking your fields for alfalfa weevil, you really need to do that. Across the state, we've seen an increase in activity of alfalfa weevil, and this year, because of the expense of protein in our dairy diets, trying to save every leaf we can when we harvest that alfalfa is going to be really, really important. So if you're not actively checking your alfalfa fields for levels of weevil, I encourage you to start that very quickly. And in many cases, we probably are at the stage where it is either time to treat or very close to time to treat with insecticide. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. Mike along with us each Tuesday with Milk Lines. And more of our regular Tuesday fare with you in just a moment as K-State's Charlie Lee checks in to tackle another subject under the heading of wildlife management. You're listening to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Back with us now on This Agriculture Today is former wildlife specialist Charlie Lee of K-State Research and Extension. Talk about farm pond stocking and one perspective on that this week, Charlie. In the past, we've discussed forage fish for supporting preferred sport fish species in a pond like bass. And a couple of the choices here you wanted to highlight today, the bluegill and the hybrid bluegill. And there is a difference, right?
Yes, that's a common question I get. Which of those two species is better for my pond and why? And you really need more information before you can answer that particular question. We do have about 11 species of sunfish in Kansas. You can get lots of different combinations of hybrids, and hybrid bluegill are typically the male bluegill and the female green sunfish. And under the right conditions, those hybrid sunfish can grow faster and larger and tend to be easier to catch because they're more aggressive than their non-hybrid parent species. Hybrids can grow to 10 to 11 inches and weigh more than a pound, and that makes the hybrid sunfish a pretty attractive option. However, there's a lot of misconceptions about these fish, and that's led to some disappointing results when people stock their farm ponds.
What are those misconceptions then? And that gets into deeper detail on the differences between the two.
Well, the first one is it okay to stock hybrid sunfish instead of bluegill in my pond? And hybrid sunfish should not be used as a substitute for a forage species like bluegill, particularly in new ponds. Bluegill reproduction is really the key, and it provides the necessary forage, which are small bluegill, for predator species like largemouth bass to feed on in your pond. Reproduction by hybrid sunfish is very limited. Most of the hybrid sunfish are going to be 80 to 90% male, giving it a very limited reproductive potential and makes it ideal to put into ponds that are prone to bluegill stunting. The other misconception that I hear is that you should stock these hybrids if your bluegill are not growing to a large enough size. The addition of hybrid sunfish in that type of a situation only compounds the problem. That's a lack of forage for the bluegill or the hybrids to feed on. They all compete for the same food resources at that level of the food web, and stocking hybrid bluegill are not going to produce larger fish if you already have too many bluegill in the pond. Rather, you need to do some sort of management that promotes the harvest of bluegill, and increased predation by largemouth bass is one of the most effective approaches. Either hybrid bluegill or pure strands of bluegill can benefit from supplemental feeding. They can increase their growth rates, particularly in ponds that have low fertility. You need to feed a floating fish food that's at least 25% protein. Make sure you're not overfeeding the fish. Feed them daily, small amounts, small particle size. Bluegill can be trained to come up to accept feed quite easily. It's certainly an addition to help make your pond more productive.
You mentioned the term stunting. You might explain that further and how that factors in here.
Well, stunting is when you get too many fish of the species that you're targeting, but they don't ever reach the size category that you're searching for. It's like overstocking cattle in a pasture. With too many fish in a pond, not enough removed, or you don't take them out quick enough, you run out of food resources. And that just leaves to fish that aren't able to express their full genetic potential because they've been on reduced nutrient levels for most of their lifespan. Fish do the best when they're fed to meet all of their energy requirements from the time that they've been put in the pond. And you can't do that with having too many fish of one species in the pond, because the ponds are a finite resource and you can overuse the resources within that pond.
And in turn, if that stunting occurs, that can be a detriment to your preferred fish like bass.
Well, largemouth bass can help out of a stunting situation, but oftentimes a largemouth bass need to feed on the smaller size bluegill. And sometimes when they stunt at a level of, let's say, 5 to 6 inches in length, that's almost too large for many of the bass to feed on. Unless you've got a lot of trophy-sized bass in the pond, you may not have enough predators in the pond to get that number of bluegill back in check. Oftentimes people complain about stunted bluegill in the pond. They're simply not harvesting bluegill at a high enough level, or in other cases, they're harvesting too many largemouth bass, which also harvest the bluegill.
All of this said, then, is there any scenario in where a hybrid bluegill would be a choice for pond stocking?
Yes, I like hybrid bluegill for ponds, particularly when they may be a kid fishing pond and you don't have large predator fish in the pond. Allow those hybrid bluegill, the males, to grow quick and fast, catch them out, and if you don't have a lot of predator fish in the pond, your hybrid bluegill aren't going to reproduce at a very high level. So you've got a lot of resources in the pond from the beginning parts of that food web to support those bluegill, so they should grow very quickly. They're more aggressive, they're easier to catch, and it's really a great activity for kids that are getting started in fishing.
But if you're wanting to concentrate on bass, you want to lean toward the pure, if you will, bluegill.
Yes, you want to put a forage fish in there that's going to meet the needs, and hybrid bluegill aren't going to be able to reproduce frequently enough to support largemouth bass.
Once again, that's addressing a question that Charlie has encountered from farm pond owners over the years. That is, whether bluegill or hybrid bluegill should be the forage fish of choice when stocking a farm pond. Charlie, thanks for the information. He's a former wildlife specialist with K-State Research and Extension. Charlie Lee. That caps off our Tuesday edition. Every once in a while, we remind you that if you haven't taken advantage of our podcast service, where you can hear replays of each and every one of our broadcasts, do so by going to agtoday.net, where each day's program is archived. You can also arrange to have the program automatically downloaded to your mobile device right there, agtoday.net. In the meantime, thanks for being along with us right here today. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.